Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my tree.
Episode 141, Captain Earnshaw. Charles Tasman Earnshaw was the marine underwriters engineer and surveyor, as well as a paddle steamer captain at Echuca from the 1870s. Charles Earnshaw was born in Rotherham, Yorkshire in April 1845 to Samuel Earnshaw and Anne Thompson. He was one of 3 children, although his siblings died in early childhood at Rotherham, England. Joseph died at the age of 3 and Anne also at the age of 3. His parents had married on the 11th of April 1841 in Sheffield, Yorkshire, West Riding. Samuel married Elizabeth White in 1852. Some families' trees say that they married at Rotherham in Yorkshire, England, and others say in America. There is no marriage record to substantiate this. Interestingly, family trees indicate that Anne, Charles's mother, did not die in England until 1856. Charles's half-sister and Samuel and Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth Maria, was said to be born in America in 1852 based on her death registration in Victoria. She died in 1854. When Samuel and Elizabeth immigrated to Melbourne on the Anne Hood from New York in 1853, Charles was 7. Samuel and Elizabeth had also given birth to Betsy Maria Earnshaw in the US in 1851 and a son who was possibly born on the voyage. Samuel and Elizabeth had 12 children in total, although 8 did not survive into adulthood. They lived at Sandridge, now known as Port Melbourne, where Samuel worked as a machinist until 1867. On the 20th of October 1855, Samuel put an advertisement in the paper. Wanted an experienced smith for hammer making, also a hammerman. Apply to Samuel Earnshaw, Walter Powell's ironmonger. And then a patent for an invention was applied for by Samuel Earnshaw. Samuel Earnshaw of Sandridge, stove, grate and fender maker, has applied for a patent for improvements in portable cooking apparatus to be called or known as Earnshaw's Patent Kitchener, and has deposited his specification at this office on the 22nd day of July 1862. And then there was an article in October 1862 by the Victorian Rifle Association, and they were saying that Mr. S. Earnshaw of Melbourne prepared 2 ingenious instruments shaped like dumbbells, which tested the triggers for £3 and £6 pulls. Yesterday it was credited Mr. Earnshaw with the invention of the weighing instrument in use by the association, but it appears now that he was only the manufacturer, the patent being devised by Sergeant Macready of Carlton Rifles and only made to order. In 1864, in the Police Gazette, stolen from the foundry of Samuel Earnshaw in Bay Street, Sandridge, 100 feet of leather belting, 10.5 inches wide and half an inch thick. On the 8th of January 1864, Samuel was advertising his cooking ranges, manufactured by him at the Bay Street foundry in Sandridge. It says these ranges have an advantage over the imported ones as they have wrought iron boilers, are more durable, less expensive and more sightly. Samuel's foundry was opposite the George Hotel in Bay Street, Port Melbourne. On the 28th of February 1865, there was an application for a publican's licence. To the Bench of Magistrates at Sandridge in the County of Burke in the Colony of Victoria, I, Samuel Earnshaw, iron founder, now residing at Sandridge, do hereby give notice my intention to apply to the Justice sitting in the Court of Petty Sessions at Sandridge for a certificate authorising a public licence for a house situated in Bay Street, Sandridge, containing of 2 sitting rooms and 2 bedrooms, exclusive of those required for the use of my family. The house is of brick, is not now licensed and rented by Mr. Thomas Slater, and is at present unoccupied, which I intend to keep a public house under the sign of the Foundry Hotel. However, by the 27th of April, so only a couple of months later, in the Supreme Court of the Colony of Victoria, between Abraham Goldberg, plaintiff, and Samuel Earnshaw, defendant, notice is hereby given that the Sheriff of the Colony of Victoria will cause to be sold by public auction the Foundry Hotel in Bay Street, Sandridge. So he became insolvent. He listed himself as an iron founder and a licensed victualler, and the causes of insolvency was depression in business, pressure of creditors and seizure of effects. His liabilities were £528 and assets $709, leaving a surplus of £181. And then on the 30th of August 1865, in the Supreme Court of the Colony of Victoria, in the estate of Samuel Earnshaw of Sandridge, ironmonger, he intends to apply for a certificate of discharge, and his certificate of discharge was granted on the 9th of October. On the 8th of December, though, auction sales in the Supreme Court of the Colony of Victoria, Samuel Earnshaw is the defendant. Notice is hereby given that the sheriff will cause to be sold by public auction at 1 o'clock Earnshaw's foundry of Bay Street, Sandridge. So again, he had to declare himself insolvent on the 23rd of May 1867. So around 18 months later, Samuel Earnshaw of Melbourne, stove manufacturer, causes of insolvency, falling off in business and losses sustained during the time of confinement in jail on a fraud summons. Liabilities £216 and assets £60, with a deficiency of £156. I couldn't find anything in the jail records in Victoria or an article stating what the confinement in jail in regards to fraud was. However, Samuel died on the 15th of December 1885 in East Melbourne. He was listed as an iron founder at the time of his death and stated that he was a resident of Sandridge for 32 years and died of dropsy after a long painful illness at the age of 64. So getting back to his son Charles, Charles was educated in Melbourne and was apprenticed as an engineer. He married Anne Ruth Monk in Victoria in 1865. Anne had been born at Battery Point, Tasmania, to James Monk and Sarah Ann Bassett in August 1847. Her father, James Monk, was a convict. At the age of 22, he was sentenced at the Warwick Assizes for housebreaking for a term of 7 years transportation after 1 month's imprisonment. At the time, he was a labourer and gunstoker from Evesham, England. He left on the Waterloo on the 18th of November 1834 and arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the 3rd of March 1835. By 1841, James was free by servitude, and on the 31st of August 1841 asked for permission to marry. He married Sarah Bassett in Hobart in April 1842, and James was listed as a shipwright on their marriage certificate. The family immigrated to Victoria in March 1853 and lived at Buninyong in Victoria. On the 17th of August 1866, in Sandridge, it mentions that a transfer of the licence for a house known as the Foundry Hotel from Charles Earnshaw to George Percy was granted. So it seems that with his father's insolvency, that his son got him out of trouble and took on the licence of the Foundry Hotel at one point. Charles and Anne had 13 children, 8 that survived childhood. They lived at Port Melbourne initially until around 1875 when they moved to Echuca. On the 28th of March 1876, tenders were in the newspaper, wanted tenders for building a 4-bedroomed house, labour only, and also for a sinking well, applied to Charles Earnshaw of Hume Street South. Charles held the position of marine surveyor in Echuca for over 40 years. He also was a part owner in the boat The Undaunted that was built in Echuca in 1875, the year that he arrived there. In 1901, Charles Earnshaw procured plans and specifications for a car and made wooden moulds and patterns for a car's engine and transmission on a lathe that he built himself. The local foundry, Freeman's, did the casting and machined the required parts. According to Charles's grandson, he had it running in 1902. The car started as a single cylinder, and then Charles later changed it to a 2-cylinder engine. There was no side door for the rear passengers who had to enter from the back, up to a step and through a small door. There's a photo taken with his daughters in 1908 that I'll put on Facebook. And the car was sold to a station owner up near Hay in New South Wales, and parts of the car remain in the Port Precinct at Echuca in the old police station museum. Charles's grandson, Tom Judge, is quoted as saying, "Grandpa always said there were 2 kinds of people who should own cars, millionaires and damn fools." On the 14th of September 1889, help for Deniliquin. Mr. Charles Earnshaw yesterday sent a telegram to Mr. Chanter of Sydney with the following effect. "My steam launch, Ethel, at your government services for the Deniliquin flood, if your government will be responsible. We think this is very considerate of Mr. Earnshaw and worth of commendation." There's another paddle steamer that he was involved in owning. On the 14th of January 1891, launch of a pleasure boat. Quite a mild sensation was created along High Street yesterday afternoon at the spectacle of a pretty little steamboat being drawn through the street on a trolley. It turned out to be the Eva, which has been built in Echuca by Mr. Earnshaw at his residence in Hume Street, and is a monument of what one man is capable of producing with the assistance of his 14-year-old boy. Mr. Earnshaw commenced the work about a year ago and has brought it to a successful issue. The Eva is a steam launch 40-foot overhaul with a width of 8 foot 2 inches, 4 feet depth of hold with a sheer of 6 inches. She is iron framed, ironed on the top sides with red gum bottom. About 2 o'clock yesterday, with Captain Lewin and the builder on board, the Eva was lifted from the trolley and lowered over the wharf onto the bosom of the Murray, where she will be family pleasure boat. The entire work is Mr. Earnshaw's. He's made everything, including the steel tube boiler and the 2.5 horsepower engines with which the little boat will be propelled. Her draft is a very light one, so she'll be able to run at any depth of the river. The boat is a good specimen of the marine engineering skill of our townsman, Mr. Earnshaw. And on the 19th of February 1892, a pleasant outing. Through the generosity of Mr. Earnshaw, the teachers of the Echuca Presbyterian Sabbath School spent a most enjoyable outing on the Murray last Wednesday evening. The fine and comfortable pleasure steamer Eva, leaving Echuca shortly after 4 p.m, proceeded several miles down the river where a halt was made, and the party of 17 or 18 settled themselves in a shady spot for a few hours of merrymaking. Tablecloths were laid and the good things of this life were freely partaken of. Several games were indulged in before the start home was made at 8 o'clock. Echuca was reached shortly before 10 o'clock, the intervening time being pleasantly passed in singing. Before dispersing, Mr. Drummond, on behalf of the company, thanked Mr. Earnshaw for the great treat he had given them and called out for 3 cheers to him, with an additional one for Mrs. Earnshaw, which was hardly given. In acknowledgment, said he only regretted the river had been so very low, which made it impossible to escape an occasional touching on the snags in the bed of the river. In the 1909 Echuca census, Charles was listed as an engineer, and on the 25th of May 1914 in the Echuca Riverine Herald, it outlined early Echuca history with some interesting details, and Charles Earnshaw of Echuca wrote to the editor, "I have read with pleasure in several issues of your valuable journal of the early Echuca days, and perhaps the enclosed may be of interest to your readers. The first steamer to arrive very near to Echuca was the Mary Ann, owned by the late W. Randall of Morwee, South Australia. This steamer came up to Echuca in 1853 or 1854. The Lady Augusta took first wool from Boom Boom in 1854, the Mulgawanky, the next steamer up the Murray in 1860, the Grappler, which was built at Echuca Park in 1858, was employed in snagging up the river as far as Warparilla Station. Hopwood, or King Hopwood of Echuca, manager for Mr. Archer of Melbourne when he first came to Echuca, was to manage the boiling down for Mr. Archer in about 1850. Mr. G. Maiden of Moama charged £1 per dray over his punt at the old crossing above Echuca. H. Hopwood, not to be beaten, crossed the Teamsters free. Hopwood, having a public house at the boiling down 17 miles below Echuca, brought custom to his house. With gold having broken out and trade at the boiling down being slack, Hopwood shifted upstream to Icy's Bend. Hopwood having brought Captain Davis to Echuca, it was then that his assistance and skill, by sending to Melbourne for 2 coils of rope and making a raft, he was able to cross sheep to the Victorian bank, with the river being in flood at that time. He was able to land sheep from the New South Wales High Bank over to the Echuca side. Hopwood built the Bridge Hotel where it now stands, showing the skill of Mr. Hopwood in designing a well-built house. As far as appearances, it compares with any of our up-to-date upcountry buildings. Hopwood built the Campaspe Bridge over that river, right opposite the Bridge Hotel. Hopwood almost completely cut off Maiden's Punt, some 2 miles by river upstream, and having the paddocks for accommodation, was able to compete with Maiden in every particular, and also had the tact to know how to treat the Teamsters, and soon gained their confidence. Charles Earnshaw's wife, Anne, died in June 1922. On the 9th of April 1930, the Echuca Riverine Herald announced the death of Charles Earnshaw. At the age of 86 years, Mr. Charles Earnshaw, one of the pioneers of Echuca, died yesterday at Sandringham. He was born in Yorkshire in 1845 and landed from the barque Anne Hood in Hobson's Bay at the age of 7. He remembered the ship Nelson being pointed out to the captain by the pilot when he came aboard at the scene of a robbery of £40,000 under shipment from England. This robbery was outlined in an episode of its own, episode 94. Mr. Earnshaw was one of the first scholars of the Church of England Grammar School in St Kilda Road. He was instructed as an engineer and occupied the position of marine underwriters surveyor for over 40 years at Echuca. In March 1864, he transported the yacht Firefly, originally belonging to Alderman Cosgrove, to Echuca. 2 wagons were employed, one for the boat and the other for the machinery. Mr. Earnshaw used to talk with zest of old river days and skippers he knew, the long procession of heavily laden boats, which were his favourite topics. Those were the days, he said, in 1885 when 95,000 bales of wool passed over the Echuca wharf for shipment overseas. It was a gladdening sight, those towering piles of wool, 1,600 of them on a single keel being floated to their moorings. It was his work to keep a check, as the plimsoll of the underwriters, on the draft of the cargoes insured by them. Those tariff days were far from dull when shearers, sawyers, boat hands, jackaroos and bullock drivers foregathered at the waterfront with the holders of Henry Hopwood's shin plasters from his bolting down works. Mr. Earnshaw remembered 75 or 80 hotels. During the 40-odd years of his holding the position as marine underwriters engineer and surveyor in Echuca, Mr. Earnshaw built in his spare time the steamboat Eva and the 25-ton Tassie, afterwards rechristened the Despatch. He also bought the first petrol-propelled motor car in the colony in about 1896. Mr. Earnshaw retired about a month ago and went to Sandringham to live with his daughter. His family comprises of Mrs. G. Judge Echuca, Mrs. A. C. Taylor of Echuca, Mrs. E. Kirkley of Bendigo, Mrs. E. Kerms, Sandringham, and Mr. C. Earnshaw of Woodend. Charles Earnshaw's half-siblings. Samuel James Earnshaw was born in Sandridge, Port Melbourne in 1857. He married Jessie David Elder at the Bethel Chapel Parsonage in Sandridge on the 27th of June 1881. They had 4 children, 3 surviving infancy, and Samuel died on the 16th of November 1901 in Carlton, aged only 34. And his death notice says it's with regret that we have to record the death of Mr. Samuel Earnshaw, a native of the port and whose father one time occupied the present Newmarket Hotel, which in those days was known as the Foundry Hotel, as Mr. Earnshaw's father was the proprietor of a large foundry. The deceased was respected by a large circle of friends, and his death was sudden as it was unexpected. He is the brother of Mr. Charles Earnshaw, Lloyd's engineer at Echuca, and Mrs. John Williams and Mrs. Smart. And his death notice in the paper, Earnshaw, on the 16th of November at his late residence in Stoke Street, Port Melbourne, Samuel James Earnshaw, the beloved husband of Jessie Earnshaw, also brother of Charles Earnshaw of Echuca, Mrs. R. Smart, Mrs. J. Williams, and J. Earnshaw of Caulfield. A fearful shock, a pain severe, to part with one we love so dear. Our loss is great, we'll not complain, but trust in heaven to meet again. Forget him, no, we never will. We loved him then, and we love him still. We cannot tell who next may fall beneath the chastening rod. One must be first to let us all prepare to meet our God. Inserted by his loving sister Clara. And 3 years after his death, memorials, Earnshaw in loving remembrance of my dear husband Samuel James. We mourn the loss of one we loved. The best was done to save. Beloved in life, regretted, gone, remembered in the grave. And in fond remembrance of my dear brother Samuel James Earnshaw, also my dear mother Elizabeth Earnshaw, gone but not forgotten, inserted by a loving sister and daughter, C. Williams of Caulfield. The second half-sibling was Joseph Henry Earnshaw, who was born in Sandridge in 1872. He married Grace Maud Mercer in 1894, and they lived at Malvern and had 1 son, Cecil. Joseph died on the 3rd of November 1941 at the age of 69. Clara was born in 1865 in Sandridge. She married John Williams in 1883 when she was 18 and John was 20. They had 2 sons, and she died in 1900 in Victoria, aged only 35. And Louisa Earnshaw was born in 1862. She married Robert John Smart in Victoria in 1882 and died on the 26th of September 1900, aged only 38. Her death notice states, Smart at the Austin Hospital, Louisa, the beloved wife of the late R.I. Smart and sister to Charles and Joseph Earnshaw, aged 38 years, a patient sufferer gone to rest. And Charles and Anne's children, the first 3 children sadly did not survive into adulthood. Charles William Earnshaw was born at Sandridge in 1866 and died at the age of 8. John was stillborn in 1867 and an unnamed female in 1867 as well. Ethel Sarah Earnshaw was born in 1868 at Sandridge, and she married George Joseph Judge in 1891. The Judge family was mainly involved in the Victorian railways. In 1860, George's father Thomas decided that firing steamboats between Geelong and Melbourne was less lucrative, and he joined the railway department as a night lighter up at the old Spencer Street locomotive shed. He was appointed a driver in 1864 and drove locomotives on a new line being constructed northward to Echuca, which finally was reached there in 1867. George then joined the railways in 1882 and decided that he would make it a career as well. He retired in 1920 after he obtained the grade of driver in charge. They had 5 children, and on the 20th of December 1944 in the Echuca Riverine Herald was the obituary of George Joseph Judge. A resident of 77 years in Echuca with a break of only 12 months was a record claim by Mr. George Joseph Judge, who passed away on Monday at the advanced age of 83 years. He was born in North Melbourne in February 1861 and came to Echuca with his parents 6 years later. On completion of his schooling, he was apprenticed to the firm Reed and Weaven Coach Builders and joined the Victorian Railways in 1881, rising to the position of driver in charge before his retirement in 1921. In 1891, he married Miss Ethel Earnshaw, the daughter of the late Charles Earnshaw, marine surveyor, and Annie Earnshaw of Echuca. He is survived by a widow, 4 sons and 4 daughters. He was a staunch supporter of the Presbyterian Church and a member of the Board of Management for many years. He was the oldest member of the Miller Masonic Lodge. He had vivid recollections of the Big Flood in 1870 and earned his first money ferrying people across the Campaspe River at that time. He had a clear memory of many of the happenings during the early days of Echuca. He was cheerful by nature and a kindly disposition, and was esteemed by a large circle of friends who will join with the bereaved family in mourning his death. And Ethel died in Canterbury, Victoria on the 18th of March 1948 at the age of 80. And her obituary in the Riverine Herald says, Mrs. Ethel Sarah Judge, who passed away on March the 18th at the residence of her daughter, Mrs. Jacker of Canterbury, was the wife of the late George Joseph Judge. She was the eldest daughter of the late Charles Earnshaw, one of the pioneers of this town, and was born at Port Melbourne and came to Echuca as a child with her parents. In 1891, she married Mr. G. Judge, who predeceased her by 3 years. Their family comprised of 8 children, all of whom survive her. She was a staunch member of the Presbyterian Church, and for her work in raising funds for the Echuca District Hospital was made a life governor of that institution. For many years she was a member of the committee of the Girl Guides, and one of her daughters was captain. Failing health 2 years ago compelled her to leave her home in High Street and reside with 2 of her daughters. The next child was Ernest, who was born in 1870 in Sandridge, and he died on the 4th of April 1893. On the 1st of April at Echuca Hospital, Ernest Earnshaw, son of Charles Earnshaw, Echuca, killed falling off a tree. And the details of the accident on the 3rd of April 1893 in the Echuca Riverine Herald, titled A Fatal Accident. A gloom was cast over the town yesterday when it became known that Mr. Ernest Earnshaw, son of Charles Earnshaw, a well-known resident of Echuca, had met with a fatal accident and had died in the Echuca Hospital. It appears that Mr. Earnshaw, who was but 23 years of age, proceeded on Saturday last to Millawa, together with 2 of his brothers and a young lad named Frank Haig, for the purpose of shooting. They also had in the view of robbing a hive of bees. As the deceased ascended the tree and was sawing a limb, it broke. The deceased fell to the ground with the limb striking him on the head. He was partially conscious for some time and was conveyed through the kind assistance of Mr. Ryan, a farmer of Millawa, to the Echuca Hospital, who was attended to by Dr. Eakins, who held out no hope of recovery, as the unfortunate young man was suffering from concussion of the brain. He died about 3:30 yesterday morning. The greatest sympathy is felt for his bereaved parents and family, as young Mr. Earnshaw was greatly respected and well liked by a large amount of friends. He was a quiet, unassuming young man, popular in athletic circles, and he was, moreover, of that robust constitution which renders his death all the more painful. And there was an inquiry into his death, and it says that Charles Earnshaw, surveyor and marine underwriter, stated that the deceased, 23 years of age, was his son. On Saturday morning he left home with his brothers to go to the Campaspe River opposite Millawa. He heard of the accident at 8 o'clock and went to the hospital and remained with him till he died. Edwin Earnshaw stated the deceased was his brother, and he, together with others, went to Millawa on Saturday. About noon they arrived at a tree, and the deceased climbed up it, and sawing one of the limbs for about an hour for the purpose of getting a beehive, which was near the top part of the limb. The deceased descended after a time, and a young fellow named Frank Haig went up. The deceased went shooting and on his return ascended the tree and recommenced sawing. After about half an hour, the limb began to creak, and the deceased threw down the saw, and a rope was thrown over the limbs so that he could be lowered down. The limb broke before he could clear the top part of the tree, and it came down, crushing against his head with great force. The witness and his companions obtained some water and bathed the deceased's head, from which blood was flowing freely. The deceased moaned very much and asked to desist the bathing, saying, "I am very ill." After stopping the flow of the blood, the deceased, who had at first stood up with support, afterwards lay down. One of the party went to Mr. Ryan, who brought his trap and conveyed the deceased to hospital. Frank Haig, Charles Haig and Claude Earnshaw, brother of the deceased, corroborated the evidence of the previous witness. Dr. Egan deposed that 8:15 on Saturday night he received an urgent message to proceed to the hospital. He found the deceased Ernest Earnshaw lying in bed unconscious and collapsed. After an examination, he found he was suffering from fractures at the base of his skull. After advising the necessary treatment, he left and received information of the deceased's death at 3:30 on Sunday morning. From the outset, he held no hope of recovery, and a verdict of accidental death was returned. The next child was Alice Teresa. She was born in Sandridge in 1872 and died in May 1873. Edith Earnshaw, known as Edie, was born in Sandridge in 1874. She married Alfred Caulfield Taylor in Echuca on the 5th of August 1896. She was 22 and Alfred 27. They had a son Walter in 1900 and a daughter Eva. Alfred was an engineer, and Edith died in Echuca on the 3rd of January 1967 at the age of 93. The obituary of her husband, who died in March 1940, was in the paper. An old and highly respected resident of Echuca passed away at Camray on Saturday morning in the person of Mr. Alfred Caulfield Taylor. The late Mr. Taylor was born at Echuca in 1869 and lived here all his life. He was the son of the late William and Ellen Cook Taylor of Windsor, England. The early years of his life were spent on the land at Echuca North. Later he was employed by Permew & Wright and Company as an engineer, and then by Evans Brothers, which position he held until his retirement 2 years ago. He is survived by a widow who was formerly Miss Edith Earnshaw and a son and daughter. A large number of relatives and old friends attended the funeral, some of his relatives coming between 300 and 400 miles to be present. The next child was Eva Lucy Earnshaw, and she was born in Echuca in 1875. She married Thomas Alexander Dixon in 1901, and Eva died at her home, Clovelly, Bendigo, in 1956 at the age of 81. They had no children. The next child was Edwin Walter Earnshaw. He was born on the 22nd of March 1877 in Echuca. He enlisted in the Boer War. He was a forage expert, and he was part of the 6th Battalion in the Australian Commonwealth Horse Regiment. He was a staff sergeant at the Boer War on the 1st of October 1899, firstly in the 6th Battalion and then in the 2nd Victorian Mounted Rifles. He was accidentally shot in the foot at Marifantell in South Africa on the 9th of May 1900, and he was invalided to Australia and arrived on the 26th of August 1900. He returned for a second tour on the 26th of April 1902. And after returning home in May 1907, he married at Darkin, Western Australia. And it says Edwin, the eldest surviving son of Charles Earnshaw of Echuca, to Sarah Ann Gibbs, known as Dolly, the daughter of William Gibbs, JP, of Greenhill, Blackwood River, Western Australia. So after their marriage, they stayed in Western Australia, where they farmed at Arthur River near Narrogin. They had 5 children, and Arthur died in Perth on the 12th of March 1919, aged only 41. And the death notice for Edwin on the 12th of March 1919 at Perth Public Hospital, after several weary months of sickness, Edwin Walter Earnshaw, beloved husband of S.A. Earnshaw of Swanpool, Western Australia, father of Pearl, Claude, Kenneth, Eddie, and infant son Ronald. O weary heart, there is a home beyond the reach of toil and care, a home where sorrows never come, husband and father resting there. And they did have another child 10 days after the death of her husband, Arthur. So Sarah was left with 6 children after the death of her husband. Ella Ruth Earnshaw was born in Echuca in 1879. She was listed in the census as a dressmaker in 1909 and married Matthew Kirkley in 1912 when she was 33 and Matthew 32. They had no children, and Ella died in Bendigo on the 1st of December 1946 at the age of 67. Claude Tasman Earnshaw was born in Echuca on the 22nd of April 1881. He married Grace Collins on the 13th of September 1905. They had 4 children and lived in Bendigo. By the 1960s, they were living at Wood End, and Claude was an estate agent, and he died in Wood End on the 13th of January 1967 at the age of 85. May Pearl Earnshaw was born in 1885 in Echuca. On the 3rd of February 1913, at the residence of her parents at Hume Street, Echuca, she married Eric Leslie Gordon Kerms, the youngest son of the late C.E. Kerms. And Eric was employed at the Commercial Bank of Echuca, and he was transferred from Echuca to the head office on the 14th of March 1913, so only a month after they married. They had one child, Alexander, in 1913 in Hawthorne, Victoria, and May died on the 7th of February 1969 at Kew at the age of 84. And the last child of the family, Garnet Earnshaw, was born on the 24th of September 1886 in Echuca and died on the 2nd of December 1886, aged 2 months and 8 days. And to acknowledge Charles Earnshaw's contribution to Echuca, there is an Earnshaw walkway at the Port of Echuca.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.